This is a standing room only crowd for a tube strike day. I'm so grateful to see all of you in here now at this moment. I'm Gina Neff. I'm the Executive Director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy. And thank you for coming to help us think through the state of the world on what is a glorious and sunny day in London, and a day in which we think about how digital technologies and AI are shaping our communities, our societies, and our planet. I want to tell you a little bit about the journey that we have been on over these past 5 years. But first, I truly want to thank each and every one of you. It is like coming to a bit of a reunion, a big, warm, happy family reunion of people who are working in this space from very different perspectives and bringing different expertise, different sectors, different kinds of knowledge together. But then it's also the family reunion where someone brings a distant cousin that you haven't seen in generations, or people who are new to the family. So thank you for joining us today, however you have been with us on this journey. The organizational psychologist Carl Weick famously has a phrase: you can't see what you think. You can't know what you think until you see what you say. You can't know what you think until you see what you say. And that describes a lot of the journey that we have been on at MCTD over these past 5 years. We stumbled into our powerful convening power, both thanks in part to the tables set at Cambridge University, but also thanks to many of you in the room, to recognize that having a place in the UK where we can come together, sit, listen, be heard, really gives us an opportunity to think how we can shape the future of policy. I was new on the job when just really less than a month, when I got an email asking if we would host a session of the Joint Committee on the Online Safety Bill. I wasn't even sure what a joint committee was or what it did. I certainly wasn't yet up to speed on what the online safety bill could be and what it meant for this country. But I came to realize through that process that even parliamentarians need a place like a university seminar where they can come and see what they say. They can know what they think by seeing what they say, that they can come, ask questions, be heard, and in that instance, turn the cameras off, meet outside of Westminster. In this case, it was actually on Zoom, thanks to it being 2021, and help understand in that particular instance what safety by design might be. And when I realized, actually, a lot of what we can do is help bring research, insight, and knowledge to different kinds of communities outside of our classrooms and seminar rooms, to help them see what they think. And you please come in. We're all one big happy family. People we know, and find a seat, it's fine, we're casual here. So giving people that space to think. And it has been one of the most inspiring things for me over the past 4 years that I've been running the center, is seeing these tables, bringing people to them, and helping transform how they see the world, not through my eyes, but through listening and being heard. We also do other things, right? I think one of our strengths is really bridging cutting-edge research to those communities. So helping to connect ideas and themes that are happening in one part of the research arena to another, and helping bring the best ideas of research into the areas in which they can be a part of the playbook. I think of this as translating the state of art into action. It's actually a job, and it's tough work, because those of us who do research are often buried very far and deep. Our heads are down into fine points and details, but then figuring out how those ideas might play in the world is almost another skill set. And I'm really extraordinarily proud of our team who do this. Our own insights that we offer through the center, through the reports we've written, the evidence we've given, the various submissions we've been a part of, they often draw on years of research. And here's where I insert the embarrassing example. I actually have that in my notes. Insert embarrassing example. For example, I was on the phone negotiating the ethical review practices for my study, for the book manuscript that I have just finished. Just finished the book manuscript, very excited. It's called Building Digital Futures, thank you. Several of you have been on this journey with me. I was at the very start of that journey when doctors walked into the room I was in and said, Mrs. Neff, that's what they call you when you're in labor and delivery. They said, Mrs. Neff, it's time to wheel you into labor and delivery. Literally, the birthday of my twins is the birthday of this book, and friends, they turned 17 last week. That's the embarrassing. So yes, sometimes we spend years. We don't have 17 years, though, to wait for how we think about what AI is, what emerging technologies might do to our society, and certainly at the speed of government, the speed of industry, we can't wait for those fine and nuanced details. That's why we're here. Here today, we are canvassing to see what we think together collectively. Not so you inform and influence how we do our work, yes, that's true, but also so that you leave today with some ideas, hopefully seeing the world differently, with some ideas that you take into your work. So let me tell you about the spirit of today before we start our first panel, almost on time. I have really been inspired by some of the great conveners in this country. I'm going to invoke James Harding from the work that he has done through Tortoise and some of the other convenings that he has gathered, of bringing people together and really listening and seeing how they might go forward. We have another great convener in the room today. We are honored to have Antonio Zappulla from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And their annual trust conference is truly extraordinary for bringing ideas and people together. And it's in that spirit, not that there is a panel of experts on the stage, that I want to begin our journey of today. So let me tell you a little bit about how the day works, and then I'll make sure, team, that I cover these housekeeping notes as is my job. My team gives me the job, and I'll make sure that I do this. We will have 3 panel sessions over the course of the day. They will start with provocations. I hope that those last no more than 15 to 20 minutes total. And then we spend the rest of that convening panel hour thinking together. Cameras are on for the first 15 minutes. They will be pointed this way. I will cue them to turn off, so recording will be off during our discussion. We will operate then under Chatham House rule. So those of us on stage will be recorded. Those of us not on stage will not be recorded, nor your names attached to the information under Chatham House rule. Then, with about 10 to 15 minutes left in that discussion, we'll bring it back to the stage for wrap-up. Cameras will come on, and I'll ask the panel to reflect and respond to the conversation you just had. If you don't want your photograph taken, please see a member of our fabulous team. I'm looking, Tom is in the back, and just make sure that we know, and we'll make sure you are not photographed. Let's see, housekeeping. When all of today's events will happen in this room. When we serve lunch, we'll go back to the room where we had coffee, and there are standing tables scattered all around. We're the only group in this space, so feel free. There are also 2 spaces where you could step in to take a cheeky little Zoom call as the world turns. I hope you can join us later today. After we gather today at 4 o'clock, we'll go 3-minute walk away to 180 Strand. There we will be joined by a larger group for drinks, and there'll be many of us walking over together. There are no fire drills expected, but there are fire exits on both sides. Bathrooms are back and towards the stairs. Turn right as you see the stairs and follow them that way. Our team are on hand. They're the ones with the red stripe on their name tags. And you should have a program with details of today's proceedings. Are they talking you've got the research files? Yes. We've talked about that. Great. I now have space for introducing themes. I have 3 themes that I want us to talk about. It's been an extraordinarily busy year. I don't know about all of you, but I feel like I am sprinting constantly, and I also feel like I am under constant threat, constantly, everything. We are starting the day, again, on this day, talking about AI and protecting democracies. And there are many ways we can be thinking about and slicing that. I've got 3 extraordinarily brilliant co-conspirators here to talk with us about that, and I'm queuing them because I'm going to invite them up in just a moment. Next, we'll move into thinking about what a flourishing UK economy would look like. So there's much being said about AI and growth. We're in a growth and productivity predicament in this country. And we have many things we need to put in place to get society ready, capable, and stable for a flourishing UK economy. During lunch, I will say, we will have some posters up with the reports and some of the evidence that our team have done. Feel free to discuss. We'll be having plenty of time during then. And then this afternoon, we will bring us together around AI and thriving societies. There's a lot to be done in thinking both about the potential harms of AI and digital technologies, but also the gaps in our current legal, cultural, social, regulatory systems. What do we need to get in place to make sure people can flourish and thrive in societies powered by AI? And then finally, I'm going to give a little charge to the room. I'll bring up Anne-Christine Glenster at the end of the day, who is currently the Associate Director and soon to be the Co-Director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy, and we'll have hopefully a charge to send us out to and with about what directions we have going forward for tech policy in this country. So with no further ado, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to really, truly thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation today, and I want to invite Antonio, Elizabeth, and Nayana up to stage. Please join me.
Actually, what would be excellent?
What would be excellent?
I think I know that I can always do that.
While we're doing a quick shift, we'll give people a chance to coming in early. You're welcome. You've changed mine, really. So, it's been quite a year. The year started out thinking and wondering how we are going to react and respond to geopolitical changes in the United States, changes around rising populism. I wrote an essay that was published, was written just after Trump was elected, the week he was elected, and it was published just before he was inaugurated. And the title of that, which you can read online, I'm giving you homework already, is Can the Democracy Survive AI? And here we are, 9 months later. I'm sure we have very clear answers to that. I'm really honored to be here with this incredible panel. Antonio Zappulla is the head of the Thomson Reuters Foundation and the head of the annual Trust Conference. And one of the things I really admire about Antonio is he's always championed and advocated for how free and fair information really plays a role in democratic societies. I'm going to start off with Antonio. Give us a bit of the lay of the land of what you're seeing at play right now.
First of all, thank you for advertising the Trust Conference. It's a free event. It's on the 21st and 22nd of October. So register, and if you can't get through, drop me an email. It's antonio.zappulla@tr.com, and I'll make sure that you come in. And it's an event where we perhaps unpack a lot of these issues that intersect within democracy and the information ecosystem. When we started to work on AI 2.5 years ago, even some of my staff members and people working with me asking me, why don't you work on AI? What is it going to do with you? But our work and our mission is really to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies. And so at the time, I was going back to them and saying, really, don't you see a link between this massively disruptive technology and the information ecosystem, fairness, and freedom? Now, the good news is that I don't get those questions anymore, but I don't get those questions anymore because 2.5 years later, it's pretty evident the impact that this technology is having already on the information ecosystem and on civil liberties. And of course, we know that in 2.5 years, the entire world is tilting in a very different direction. I don't know if you follow the VDEM reports. The VDEM Institute compiles this global status of democracy report that comes out every year. And it's achieving read. At this moment in time, we have 91 elected autocracies around the world and 88 democracies. And if we put this in percentage of people, that means that 12%, actually less than 12% of the world's population lives in a democracy. And 3 out of 4 people in the world live in a democracy. And that's the lowest number of people living in a democratic society that we've seen in 50 years. And the truth is that the trend is here to stay. Another very trustworthy report that we monitor every year is the Edelman Trust Barometer. There's a lot to unpack in that report. But one number, by the way, this is a global report, it's 33,000 people in 28 countries. What it tells us is that at the moment, 61% of Americans believe that leaders, and I quote, would be better off without interference from courts or Congress. That's the highest level in 2 decades. Channel 4 here in the UK released a report a couple of months ago. And this looks, by the way, at the younger generation, people between the age of 13 and 27. 52% of youngsters in this country believe, and I quote, that the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge and if he or she didn't have to bother with parliament or elections. And we're getting similar reports from SWG in Italy to Spain, France, and Germany. This data is consistent. Marine Le Pen won 30% of the youth vote in the French election. The AfD won 10% more of youth vote in the latest German election. So I think we need to abandon the illusion that this is just a temporary glitch and that we will somehow return to the benign world order of the late 90s and early 2000s, because it won't. This trend is here to stay. And so what does it mean at this moment in time when we have rising autocracies and rising technology? We just look at the picture of the inauguration of Trump, surrounded by tech leaders. Now, we don't fully know how this will pan out, but we know already that there will be significant challenges to the information ecosystem, significant challenges to electoral integrity, and significant challenges to civil society. I would say there is a fundamental risk to undermine truth. And again, if you go back to the Edelman report, we know that at the moment the least trusted institutions in the world are media and governments. And especially when you look at LLMs, they are designed in a very binary system. There's this great report that came out actually last week by OpenAI and the Georgia Institute of Technology that really demonstrates how hallucination is almost by design. The systems are trained to give you a binary answer, and actually they're not rewarded, with the exception perhaps of Claude and Anthropic, of actually saying, I don't know. So the fundamental risk that we see is challenging the truth. We already live in a post-truth society where facts have become opinion. Significant challenges to the information ecosystem. Challenges when it comes also to the cost of producing information in an environment where rising production costs and product costs are already endangering the sustainability of newsrooms. And then obviously issues of inequality in terms of when it comes to the production of this technology, when it comes to skills, when it comes to computing power, when it comes to ownership. I mean, I was looking at the latest market cap of the top technology companies that work in AI. We're looking at over $16 trillion. That's more than any GDP of any G20 nation, with the exception of US and China. And that's 4 times the GDP of Japan. So the dynamic between society, tech companies, and state is fundamentally changing.
And that brings us to, I think, scaling up and out internationally. It's rare that you get to you schedule panels in advance and then headlines change. But we are so lucky to have Dr. Nayana Prakash from Chatham House with us, who is working on their international security and technology program. And you may recognize her from the extraordinary amount of media we have done over the last few days around Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing these challenges in a post-truth society play out very quickly.
Thanks so much, Dina. Yeah, it's been a pretty crazy 48 hours. Actually, what's really interesting about what's happening in Nepal with regards to protests and with regards to protests around corruption is that social media has been a really key tool in that. Not necessarily AI related, but I think the ways that young people utilize social media and connection in that way is something that we're going to see more and more, I think. I was really interested in the comments that you made, and I think you've made some great points about information ecosystems. I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with ChatGPT. Maybe you use it on a regular basis, maybe your industries use it, whether or not you are happy with that decision. Maybe your academics and your students are writing essays with ChatGPT. I mean, it's obviously changing people's work lives on quite a significant scale. I think from an international security perspective, a trend that we've noticed in the last year is that AI, unfortunately, is power. And big tech is power. And we've seen the rise in kind of AI diplomacy and tech diplomacy in the last year. And I think a really good example of this is NVIDIA chips being given to the Gulf to build new kind of AI hubs in different parts of the world. Obviously, this kind of change and this, the idea of chips and the idea of AI being exported to different parts of the world may include more players in the so-called AI race. But on the other hand, what kind of process of diplomacy and democracy is this, and who actually holds the power, and who actually holds the cards? The other point is that if AI is power, that means that the companies that produce AI are extremely powerful and more powerful than before. We're seeing the kind of militarization of AI and the militarization of consumer big tech companies. The Pentagon has recently signed major contracts with companies like Meta, like OpenAI, which is a first for OpenAI. And obviously, we're seeing other big tech companies in other parts of the world participating in this, most especially in Palestine and Gaza. So I think the militarization of big tech, the further concentration of power, you mentioned Trump's inauguration. I think that was a really striking visual of tech CEOs being the non-democratically elected leaders of a changing world order. So certainly, tech is power, tech is money, but it is not necessarily democracy. And I'm really interested. Oops, I did anything wrong, but I'm just going to keep talking. You also mentioned, I was really interested in your point about autocracies and democracies, because I think I'd like to think about those democracies for a second. What kind of democracies are there, and what kind of democracies are considered in this? Because we live in a democracy right here in the UK, but there's been a breakdown in societal cohesion, in societal resilience, in the relationships that people have between other communities and the government. AI is not necessarily the reason for all these changes, but it is certainly one aspect of a breakdown in trust and a rise in fear. Because Gina, I think you mentioned that people are afraid, and I think being afraid of what is to come with AI is an aspect of this. And maybe at some point today, the panelists will talk about building, I think, better futures and brighter futures, which I think is a really significant part of this. Like, how can we change the narrative, and how can we ensure that people aren't afraid, whether it's of AI or of their governments more widely. But it's definitely quite a gloomy global picture, I'm sorry to say.
And with that, we're going to turn to some glimmers of hope and pragmatism. I'm going to bring in Dr. Elizabeth Seeger. She leads on Demos's work on technology, including AI. And there's a new program of work around epistemic security. So I'm going to bring you in to say, how does the picture look from perspective here at home?
Yes, so I will talk about epistemic security, but I want to come back to a point we were just mentioning, this fact that democracy it's not just under threat now from AI. This has been a problem that's been building. We have rising cost of living, we have buckling public services, we have rising house costs, increasing inflation, and people generally have this sense that government's just not serving them well. So we want to convince people democracy is good, but objectively people are sitting there and being like, yeah, how? Show me what this is doing for me. And that's the crisis of trust that we're in right now. And so at Demos our strategy is around rebuilding the trust between citizens and state. We're looking towards building a new deal between citizens and state, where citizens engage in democracy, but in return, they see how that engagement is being returned. They see how their input is being reflected into the policies that are being made. And so from the technology perspective and the work we're doing is we're looking at how does technology influence this new deal, the trust between citizens and state. And we can look at how technologies like AI might directly undermine this deal between citizens and state and that trust. Of course, this happens in democratic processes like elections, when you can see technology and its direct impacts on how information flows. But it's also about how the state decides to use technology. I mean, it's been in the news lately, the police force, law enforcement roll out facial recognition, and there's a lot of public jitters about how these technologies are being used. And so part of building that relationship and strengthening democracy is going to be about framing how government is using these technologies, how government is making decisions about how they're using these technologies, and really including citizens in that decision-making process. And then, of course, AI could also play a role in servicing that new deal and relationship. So when we think about things like the great work that Audrey Tom's doing with platforms like Polis, at Demos, we're running a big program called Waves, using Remesh and other AI work-based program to do giant, 1,000+ people participatory processes in local councils for really local decision-making, where we can close that loop and citizens can see how they input and that directly influences policy. So I think these are the kinds of steps we need to take, and ways that technology can both undermine those relationships and serve to reinforce it. The other project you mentioned that we're working on speaks directly to this mis and disinformation issue is the epistemic security program. it's kind of maybe a poorly named program. No one understands what it means directly off the bat, but we couldn't find a better name. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, and epistemic security is about securing our knowledge and information pipelines. How is that information transferred? Where is our information produced? How is it disseminated? How is it modified? How is it consumed and used to make decisions? And it's by securing those pipelines that we can help build more robust democratic processes to make the kinds of decisions we need as a democratic society. We're doing a really cool project under that umbrella right now where we're going into very deep, dark places and looking at a bunch of different potential crisis scenarios for the UK and ways that threats to our epistemic environments could either exacerbate or catalyze or lead to complete catastrophic breakdown scenarios in the UK. And so at first when we started this program, it felt like a real stretch. Like you really had to put on your tin hat and think, how does this go really bad? But then as we're writing these scenarios, we get news reports coming in that look very similar. You can see how they roll out. So these are things like bank runs turning into economic collapse, famine scenarios. We have xenophobic violence scenarios very similar to Southport. We have youth isolation and election interference. But just a really wide array of scenarios and looking at how really common epistemic factors and information pipeline factors are causing breakdowns in all these scenarios, and then looking towards what kind of interventions we can have in those spaces. So I don't know if that's a glimmer of hope so much as maybe a first step towards identifying just like I guess kind of like the low-hanging fruit, which is the obvious things we need to start doing to build those more robust information environments.
That's a great way to segue now into bringing all of you into this conversation. And again, we've imagined this as a conversation. I'm going to ask the cameras, please. The cameras are off. Recording. I'm going to do just a very quick, yes, I'm going to do just a very quick summary of the discussion that we've had because we have 17 brilliant points from the room. And really we're surfacing these questions of how we bring people into this conversation around policy on information. How do we bring professionals into this, and what kinds of work do we need to shore up and build around building an infrastructure and ecosystem of people to help guide these? We've talked a bit about what's the role of education, and really truly what's the role of educating on what it means to be human in arts, humanities, etc. in going forward. We've had several people push back on these questions of democracy and the sense of urgency that we're having right now around it. And I don't want to drop the concerns that are being voiced around what is this going to mean when we supercharge AI prompt results with advertisements, and really, how are we addressing some of the economic drivers that are fundamentally at play here? And in 10 short minutes, our panel is going to answer every single one of them. This is your viva voce. Again, welcome to your exam. But I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance just to respond and reflect, both on what we've heard, but also on what they've heard from each other. Who would like to start?
We'll just go more.
Sure.
Sounds good. I think one of the things that popped out to me in the conversation was this obvious tension that we're facing. I'm like, we like the idea of epistemic security, and yeah, we need to bolster our information pipelines, and let's keep that information secure. But like, how do you do that? And where do you draw the line? You have this running with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and we saw everything that was happening with the NSOI team in DSIT trying to do some amount of social media monitoring for violent content, and how that really backfired. And one of the crisis scenarios that we're considering in our crisis scenario workshop is actually exactly the point you brought up, which is, here's the crisis scenario. A very reputable think tank in London does this crisis scenario project and makes some recommendations to government, and news media gets a hold of that, and it massively backfires and is seen as overreach. So like, this is a problem, and I think like, coming to the urgency point, like, is there government urgency around this point? I think, yes, there's government urgency. They see the threat, but the answer, like, what do you do about it, is very difficult. And coming to a point, I think that Roger brought up, and Will spoke to as well, was some of the things we can do isn't about dictating the content that's there, but it's about thinking about things like due prominence and due accuracy. And it speaks to the engagement point as well, how do you engage citizens, is make sure that they have access to the information that is relevant to them. So we have due prominence on broadcasting and newspapers. We could do a similar thing with social media. How do you make sure that, if 75% of the public access their news through social media? Can we have some kind of due prominence on social media platforms to say, like, hey, if your IP address is in this location, make sure there's some amount of locally relevant news so that people feel connected to their communities and the policy that affects their communities, as well as just the big international stories. And I think that that's where we can start rebuilding some of that communication into the information pipelines. I wanted to just comment on one thing I had said earlier about, like, people, we talk about engaging citizens, but we can roll out consultations until the cows come home and nobody cares. It's because consultations are boring. They're incredibly boring and they're very work intensive. The only people who respond are think tanks with enough core funding to be able to sit there and respond to them. You're not going to engage normal citizens that way. And I think that that's where some of the opportunities for technology in democracy and tech-powered democracy come into play. How can we make it a really low-effort project for people to be able to engage and put their opinions down and be able to bring those together and actually make that part of the democratic process? We have to make that consultation accessible.
I'd like to bring Nayana in next. So what kinds of things do you want to reflect on?
I think there are a few points that specifically were for me, which I think Julia and Simi kind of mentioned about the militarization of AI. You made it, you asked this great question, Julia, about is it coming to Europe? And while I think we can see militarization militarization in weapons in the US and also in other parts of the world, we haven't yet seen it come to Europe. But
Ukraine.
yeah, yes, actually that's true. And the role of big tech companies in Ukraine, I think, offers like really interesting read across for what does it mean when big tech companies enter conflict zones, which I think is something we are going to see more of. And I also think that, whether or not the European countries necessarily embrace it in the way that the US has, European companies are certainly involved in this process. And so I think the greater militarization of AI is the trend we're seeing. It's one that I think is not necessarily the first thing we think of when we think of AI, because we often think of like ChatGPT and LLMs, but there is a really dark aspect to AI that is happening without any kind of public say or without any kind of due process or democracy at all. I was interested in the points about universities and schools and humanities funding. I did English degrees before I did what I'm doing now. So to see the kind of decline of humanities research is, I think, a real tragedy. I think the attacks on universities over the world, whether it's in the US, in this country, university fees have just gone up, I believe, for the first time in, is it 8 years maybe? And also, obviously, immigration rules that the UK is bringing in make it difficult for international students to come study in this country. So I think, education, and from a personal perspective, I find that very tragic. From a security perspective, what does that mean for the future of research across the world? Where are researchers meant to go? And especially, people coming from countries that don't have strong university or academic funding. It's just never been more expensive. I think that ties back to the really great point about economics, which really underpins all of this, and a lot of the stuff we think about at Chatham House is to do with this kind of geoeconomic, the fact that this country's coming out. I mean, this country's been in a state of austerity for a very long time. Many people can't remember what it was like to have access to, cheap university or free university funding, or to have access to, certain projects that this country no longer does. So how do we, make people care about things when they're mostly thinking about, well, I don't know if I can pay my heating bill this year. I think sometimes we fast pedal and we say, let's talk about AI. But there's so many things that come before we can get people to engage in what seems like very high-level discussions. And I think, Margaret, you made it, I wanted to come to that because I'm also 31 and I am also from India. And I also feel really distorted by democracy and certainly didn't realize that India was no longer on that democracy list, but that makes absolute sense to me. I've been thinking a little bit this week as I've been doing work on Nepal about what it means. That protest was referred to in the press a lot as a social media protest, which is incorrect. It's a protest that utilized social media, but at the heart of it is young people protesting against corruption and the two-tiered society in Nepal and the privilege held by government officials and their children. Obviously that protest had escalated to a point that beyond even what I think many protesters wanted, but I think that, that is one example of what democracy can look like as well, or what happens when democracy is withheld from people for a very long time. And I hope that I'd like to know more about democracy.
And on that note, Antonio.
I think, the comments that were made around the banking crisis, the dropping of living standards, I think they are absolutely right. I think tech is an enabler and an accelerator in this crisis of democracy. And so the link to the cost of living, unsurprisingly, new generations being so polarized and so disenfranchised, and the dream of buying a house is almost impossible. Everything that you just said, Elizabeth, in your opening remarks. But I think combined to this, there is also another element, which is a significant shift in ideology that we're also seeing around the world, stemming from the US, obviously. And that shift in ideology, combined with the anger, the resentment, and this sense of disenfranchisement that we're seeing, especially in younger generations, is what makes this, I think, a tipping point. Autocrats have a lot in common. They seem to all champion a regulated technology. They all want to cripple civil society. They all openly delegitimize the media. They're using increasingly lawfare, to your point about libel. So they're weaponizing the law to silence civil society and to silence the media. So there is a common trend. And I think that the trend is always very anti. So they are anti very many things that not always necessarily make sense together, but they attract specific portions of society, because even if they might not agree with the entire political agenda of an autocrat, there is enough buy-in into one anti that they bring into the pie. So this is happening very clearly in the US, where you have the evangelical Christians together with the people that want to have a completely unregulated tech, to the people that are anti-migration. So it's a really interesting, I think, phenomenon of who these new autocrats are bringing in. The day of the inauguration, I was in Florida, and I was an Uber driver that was driven by a Puerto Rican. And we were listening onto the radio, and Trump had just signed the executive order that just threatened, I don't remember the exact number of the people that rioted a Capitol Hill. And I said, I'm a dumb guy coming from the UK, who did you vote for? It's like, I voted for Trump. And I said, can you help me understand why you voted for Trump? And he said, because the economy is shit. He needs to fix the road. Look how many bumps we have on the road. I can't afford petrol and the usual story. And I said, but what do you think about the fact that he just threatened people that were actually threatening democracy? And the answer was, democracy doesn't feed me. So all these conversations that we're having, again, risk to be so insular, right? And I think we lost touch, to your point, Matt, completely with society. And this it goes back to media literacy. And I think what we're not teaching in school, I think it was you who raised the point about education, we're definitely lacking anything about civic education, which is what drives us to have zero understanding of how our political systems work. Remember what the most searched word on Google the day after the referendum was, what is the EU? Really, right? It's just go check it out. So if we don't empower the younger generation with civic education and with media literacy, I think this is going to be getting worse and worse.
the urgency that we take into our break and the conversations that we're going to have through the rest of the day. I'm going to propose we have a 10-minute break. Our next panel is going to really, our next conversation is going to really drill down on these questions of what it takes to think about here in the UK, what it takes to think about those questions of growth and equality and what that's going to mean in technology. Will you join me in thanking